Welcome back to our workshop, Interdisciplinary Dialogues in AI. My name is Ahmed, and I'm a postdoc fellow here at the SRI in Toronto. And for those of you who have just joined us, I'd like to reiterate a few logistics regarding today's workshop. So we're joined today by an online audience via Zoom, as well as the participants in the room. All sessions will be recorded and shared online after the event. This afternoon, we have 2 sessions scheduled with a short break in between. Each session will consist of short talks from speakers, followed by a panel discussion with our invited speakers and Q&A with the audience. And during the Q&A, both in-person and online participants will have a chance to pose questions to the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first session of this afternoon. What is the future of online safety and content moderation? Organized by SRI graduate fellows Ram Motilal, Alice Wang, Blake Lee Whiting, and Emily Schwartzman. This session will be moderated by Blake Lee Whiting, PhD candidate with the Department of Political Science and the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. So the floor is all yours, Blake.
Thank you so much, Hyani. Thank you to Anna, Tricia, and everyone else who's organized today. It's been so wonderful to watch these panels. Excited to be up here with some wonderful speakers. Online discussions in recent years become one of the main ways individuals access information and exchange opinions. Maybe you're on WhatsApp or Instagram Messenger during the break, or you're looking at things on Facebook. We're all doing it all the time. But traditional barriers to communication have largely disappeared, and it's increasingly difficult to verify the sources and reliability of online information. In light of problems related to polarization, misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes, etc., this afternoon's panel, we've gathered some experts to share their knowledge and insights on the latest strategies for protecting users online and thinking about the impact of content moderation on digital communities. Please join me in welcoming our 3 speakers to the stage to explore these critical topics further. We first have Professor Regina Rini, Associate Professor in Philosophy Department at York University. Professor Rini holds the Canadian Research Chair in Social Reasoning. Professor Rini's research explores a wide array of topics, including moral agency, the psychology of moral judgment, and moral status of artificial intelligence. Prior to joining York University, Professor Rini served as an assistant professor at NYU's Center for Bioethics. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Ishtiaque Ahmed, an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Toronto, who directs the innovative Third Space Research Group at the DGP Lab. Professor Ahmed's research sits at the crucial intersection of computer science and critical social sciences, with a strong focus on social justice and sustainability within the fields of human-computer interaction and ICT for development. Professor Ahmed also leads the U of T Critical Computing Seminar, co-directs the PRISM program, and guides the weekly Critical Data Science Reading Group, all of which contribute profoundly to addressing bias and marginalization in technology. Please welcome Dr. Ahmed. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Bree McEwan, an associate professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where she contributes significantly to the Institute of Communication, Culture, and Information Technology. Professor McEwan is an expert in the online diffusion of information on social issues, with a keen interest in the uses of virtual reality for social interaction education, which you might hear more about in a second. Professor McEwan currently serves as the Associate Director of the Data Sciences Initiative at the University of Toronto and is an editorial board of several key journals in the field of communication. Please welcome Dr. McEwan. Our session today will consist of short 10-minute talks from each professor about their research, followed by panel discussions with our speakers, after which we'll take questions from the audience. And so I'd like to first welcome Professor Bree McEwan to tell me more about their research. Thank you so much.
Hi, so I'm not actually going to talk about VR today, which is where some of my work has gone to recently, but another piece of my research portfolio is a theory we wrote just after the 2016 election. As you did, everyone was like, oh my gosh, on the mediated skewed diffusion of issues information, which was kind of a fancier way to get into polarization, and thinking through a lot of the processes there. So what I'd like to kind of start the panel with today and talk to you about is some of the human communication processes that go into the way that people communicate online and the kind of motivations and goals that we see in these places, because I am of the opinion, is that right? Great. That when we talk about online communities, online moderation, social network sites, et cetera, you can't technical your way out of the social, right? These things are deeply embedded in social interaction and social interaction processes that have been around since, right, I didn't want to say the dawn of time, but since the dawn of time, right? Have been around for a long, long time. And so it's really important to understand the research in human communication that allows us then to maybe have a better idea if we deploy technical systems that are going to be involved in our online moderation and thinking through the way that those organize online discourse. If we don't think through the way that humans human, then we won't have very good results from the way AI tries to manage humans. And I don't know about you, but I've got teenagers, so I've got a lot of Taylor Swift going on in my house right now. And she's got this line, right, and you need to calm down, that it sort of suggests that online communication is somehow different, right? If you said something to my face, there would be a reaction, there would be sanctions, I would be angry. But you can say it online, and because of that kind of distance, right, you get away with saying maybe lots of terrible things you wouldn't say face to face. And so when we talk about online discourse, there's a whole kind of set of research that talks about, well, is it the separation of space, right, that you're not like physically there? Is it that people could be anonymous, right, from very kind of early online spaces? Oh, well, we have all these flames and trolls and things because it's people are anonymous. And I think most people on Twitter are not anonymous, if they're still on Twitter. And Twitter, when this song was written, right, are not anonymous, and they will still say terrible things. So that's probably not it exactly. But another piece of it is that online discourse is often about networks, not groups. And so you have these kinds of spaces that allow for what Oldenburg's kind of third place idea of the neighborhood bar, the neighborhood coffee shop. And so you have Facebook or Facebook groups, you have other social network sites, Tumblr is such a delightful third place, which still exists. And you had all these kinds of spaces where people could get together, but there's a lack of physical sanctions, right? If someone comes into a bar and starts being like super belligerent and yelling at everyone, then they get kicked out, right, ideally. Or they worry because the rewards that they need to continue sort of being a successful human, right, the social support that they need from their community is invested in that physical community and being part of that group. So you have to be careful, right, what you say. You have to make sure that you align with the norms and values of the group so that way you can remain part of that social support community. Now, it works very well for groups, but it works very differently for networks, because in networks, you have other options for social support, right, and social capital, and all of these other things. And then on top of that, network relationships are exponentially complicated. And I was racking my brain trying to think of the theorist who said this originally, so if you know it, let me know later. But essentially, right, if you have a dyadic relationship, right, so you, a romantic partner, right, let's say, you have to know what's happening with this romantic partner and understand that and the rewards and things and costs in here, and that's one level of complication. If you add your mother-in-law, right, like now you have to know not only your relationship with your mother-in-law and your partner's relationship with your mother-in-law, but how your mother-in-law views this relationship, right? And so even with 3, it starts to get more and more complicated. And so if you broaden it out to bigger, broader networks, you're asking a human being to do a lot, right? And we used to, at the turn of the century, in the 2000s, right? We used to have kind of Dunbar's number and social groups would be like 120, 180. And now we see people being connected with thousands and thousands and thousands of other minds. And how in the world could you kind of anticipate what is the appropriate thing to say in a social setting? And so you see people making these sort of different decisions. Some people are like, I just won't say anything. And some people are like, I will say everything, right? And then one of the pieces I came to around 2015, when I was working on my book at the time, was trying to figure out all of these different sort of separations that people were talking about. They're like, if it's anonymous or if it's not anonymous, that's a thing, right? We have online disinhibition if you're anonymous and you control and flame away, et cetera. But if you're, and then we have like, well, if it's online or if it's offline. And none of those have like really clear-cut lines. So I don't know if you've tried to put together a typology, but as soon as you do, you find an edge case that doesn't fit. And then it's like, do you rework the, Luke's like, yes. Right? So, and then you're like, how do I fit that edge case in? I'm just like, oh, that doesn't matter. Are these the 90% who are not included in our randomized clinical trials that we were talking about earlier? And I thought, maybe it's not about the space exactly, or the technology exactly, but maybe it's about the network that you think you're communicating to. And so I have this continuum that I talk about of flexible versus fixed networks. And a fixed network, it doesn't mean you have to be the exact same performance all of the time, but it does mean that your network expects some level of consistency and coherency from your performance, and you have to perform that identity in a way that makes sense to all of that network. And the larger that network becomes, the more contexts that are collapsed into that network, the more rigid your identity performance will have to be to meet those standards of coherence for the way that people are interpreting who you are and what's appropriate for your performance. And so if you think of a fixed network, the physical face-to-face environment is a fairly fixed network. But I actually argued at the time that Facebook might have been more of a fixed network because you have more context collapse. You can get away with like doing weird things in spaces where you're not going to run into those people again, right? But Facebook, you're going to run into those people. And so you kind of have, fixed networks over here, sometimes tied to the physical self, sometimes not. And then you have these more flexible networks over here. Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon kind of hang out in the middle. It's an older slide. You can tell because Ishtiaque's still on there, right? But Ishtiaque was sort of this interesting moment in time where we had, this anonymous channel, and then they killed it. And the way that they killed it was they tried to introduce photography and pictures and be like Instagram. And I watched them announce this at a South by Southwest, that they were going to have photos now. And the scholars, we were sitting at a little table and we're like, they're dead. And they were dead in 6 months because they took themselves from being a flexible network, and that was the use case for it, and they made it super fixed. Because once you added photos, people knew who you were, where you were standing when you took that photo. And then you have things like 4chan, which, general disclosure, if you have never heard of 4chan before, please do not Google it on my behalf. Like, it's not for everyone. Don't do it. But we're going to talk a little bit about them today. So that's one problem, right? When we think about online moderation, is what kind of space are we in? Is this a network where you can have like reasonable sanctions from a social group that someone expects can reward and punish them? Or is it a completely flexible space? And it's a continuum, right? So where are we in this? So this is an example from a Facebook group. I think it's like a Chicago moms group when I lived in Chicago. And there was a post, and generally speaking, I know better than to get involved in online arguments with people I don't know. And yet, here we are. There was this particular post, and someone said, I'm so mad at my mom because she gave my 2-year-old a cereal that had honey in it. And I don't know if you have toddlers, but you're not supposed to give kids under 2 honey. And so in my head, I thought, you're probably okay because the honey's baked, because the problem with honey is botulism, right? And so the baked honey in the cereal is probably not an issue, and your kid's gonna be fine. But then there were all these comments about allergies, but it's not an allergy issue. And so this one really kind of drove me nuts, right? I was like, they're like, we gave them everything because, nature knows what's best for our children, okay? This is pre-COVID too, so like we're not even in like anti-vax land, we're just in crunchy mom land. And if we were prone to allergic reactions, we would have waited. And I'm like, oh my God, you're gonna give your kid botulism, right? So I'm trying. This is like my best communication professor. I'm like, I'm gonna go outside expert, right? I'm gonna be super nice about it. I'm gonna be like, oh my gosh, that's not quite the thing, right? Our pediatrician in Phoenix was on the team that discovered the botulism honey link. right? Here's the simple explanation. It's not an allergy issue. Interesting. Still not afraid. But good to know, thank you. I agree. Do what's best for your family. Like, you're gonna kill toddler, right? Like it's not, or you're gonna make them sick. So the problem here is not that these aren't necessarily fixed, like that's my name and whatever my profile picture was at the time, and that's their names and that kind of thing, but these are weak ties. And weak ties don't have the power to sanction in the way, like I can't find, like, also it would be weird, right? I'm not gonna go find this person and say, hey, there's a cost to this. There's no one in her network who's sanctioning, you know, that there's an issue here. So you might think, well, if we have problems with weak ties, and weak ties bring in all this sort of diverse information, and we run into these issues in communities because people are bringing kind of all this, you know, sort of diversity of ideas that maybe make sense and maybe don't make sense, maybe we should just get people to hang out with other people who are similar to them. And you can see this after 2016 in some of like the Zuckerberg memos. They're like, we're gonna make Facebook better by making sure that you only see things you agree with, right? Is the sort of underlying message. But what we were finding in some of our research is that when we start to look at what we call attitude consistent online communities, right? So people have joined these groups because they're homophilous in terms of ideas. We seek them out because they have similar opinions. So think about this, right? Like I joined the Chicago Moms group because I am a Chicago mom. And that was a pretty diverse group. But you might have other groups that you're a part of in various online things. Like you go to Reddit boards of communities that you're interested in that maybe share the same values, the same politics, et cetera, or have an interest in knitting or something, right? Like that you go to. But if it's because of an identity issue, then what happens is the online community, regardless of the quality of the information of their arguments, increases the group identification. And the more anonymous it is, side model would suggest that's going to be an even stronger effect. And so then you're going to amplify the strength of the group's position for that person and move group members to more extreme positions. And now you're going to have a defense for when someone in your, say, like real life network, your family network kind of thing comes up and says, oh, you know, this thing that you believe, you know, we're talking about your aunt, can I use this? So we were talking about Blake's aunt, right? And he's like, I can't get through to her. I bet there's an entire background of community members and attitude consistent online community that tells her this is the right thing. And when you're like, that's wrong, it's like, well, 50-1. It's not a terrible logical choice, right? Sorry. But what it means is that if we want to do online community moderation by just putting, like, just grouping like with like, we're increasing polarization within the broader society. I'm assuming the other people are going to have answers, and that's why I went first. I'm just problems. And then, to add another layer, we did a study once where we accidentally gathered about, it ended up being about 264 4chan users, because our full sample was 1,000, but we're looking specifically for online community members, and we asked them, you know, do they belong to this, this, or this? And if we hadn't included, you know, we said, do you belong to a board like 4chan, DoubleChan, et cetera? If we hadn't included the chans, I would be standing here telling you that it was all Reddit, but the Reddit users in our sample and the 4chan users overlapped so much that it's the chans drive everything. And if you're not familiar with 4chan, it has a lot of different types of message boards on it, and they're not all terrible. But I'm saying generally, I don't recommend. But there are a couple of them that are really terrible, like revenge porn and violent things and gory things, and political conversations happen there too, but not in a real intellectual way, let's say. But what we found is that actually 4chan users, they tend to be more white, but not completely white. They tend to be more male, but not completely male. I actually just looked up that number, it was 66% were male. They tend to be more educated, right? And they tend to be media junkies. They correlated with every other media channel higher than the rest of the sample. They watch everything, C-SPAN, Fox News, they're all over the internet. They're information junkies. but they are also the people who would say that they create memes, create blogs, create videos. I don't want to get into an argument about pronunciation, right? They create all of the content that then goes into the attitude-consistent online communities, and then the people in the attitude-consistent online communities, the Facebook groups, the Twitter hashtags, the listservs, which this was another gift that we threw in email listserv, but then email listserv started being more popular, particularly with information junkies just after this. The listservs, right? Then those groups see these arguments and they push them out. And another argument we've been trying to test and we're working on with some looking at memes is we suspect that if you are very attached to an issue, then you do not evaluate that issue in terms of information quality, right? And so you're willing to push out low quality information, and then other people see it and they're not convinced by that low quality argument because they're not in that identity community, right? And they go, gosh, those other people on the other side are so dumb. How could they believe this? But you would probably do the same if the argument was from your side. So the social might need some help from the technical in that we seem to have worked ourselves into this situation. Okay, good. We seem to have worked our way into this particular situation, and then we need to figure out how to use the tools and technologies to get us out of the situation. And I'm going to let my colleagues tell you how to do that.
What an awesome introduction. That was really great. Professor Rini, will you share next?
Okay. I don't have any slides for you. Okay, great. So I'm not going to be able to follow up on that because I don't do the technical side. I'm even farther from the technical side. So I'm a philosophy professor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by just explaining how I see the role of philosophy in any of this. And then I'll talk a bit more substantively. And I'm just setting a little timer for myself so that I know how long I've been talking. There we go. Okay, great. Yeah, so like I said, I teach philosophy. I teach ethics and epistemology. Everybody knows what ethics is. Just in case people haven't heard this buzzword epistemology lately, I'll briefly describe. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and justification and reasoning and that sort of stuff. And it turned out that in particular became super useful somehow in the last decade or so, that everybody started talking about an epistemic apocalypse and things like that. And so suddenly it's actually been kind of practical to have spent, the fact philosophers have spent a couple thousand years studying these concepts, and that turned out to actually have some use. So when I teach classes about the social implications of technology, and when I write about this broadly, I'm really just trying to think, what's the main model here? And the thing I found most inspiring and helpful here is a model from Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian public intellectual famous for media theory, although in his view, media means any form of technology. It's misleading calling him just a media theorist because he thinks it's all of technology. And he has this metaphor late in one of his books that it's kind of tossed off, but I find super helpful. And basically, it's about driving on the freeway. And the thought is, suppose you're worried that people on the freeway are doing crazy stuff, they're going the wrong way, they're doing bad stuff. He says the absolute wrong way to solve this problem is to slam on the brakes in front of them because they'll just crash into you, right? It's even worse to drive in reverse on the freeway. Don't do that. Rather, if you're worried about people going the wrong way and what's going to happen, you actually have to drive slightly faster than everybody else so that you get ahead of them and you can see what's coming up on the road before they do. And then I don't know, he doesn't really complete the metaphor, whether you're supposed to shout out the window or what, how you're supposed to warn them while you're busy speed driving. But the basic thought is really important, which is if, like me, you worry a lot about unanticipated social consequences of technology, the wrong solution is to slam on the brakes on the freeway. It's rather to be trying to think a little bit ahead, even while all your instincts are telling you, oh no, this is scary, something bad is going to happen. So that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is to do the McLuhan thing, to get out slightly ahead, think ahead. And for philosophers, that's actually kind of useful, because the thing is, what philosophy trains us to do, if you don't have any background in this area, you might be wondering, like what can philosophers say about this? Philosophers are about studying 2,000-year-old texts. Well, not entirely. Part of it is about thinking about abstract argumentative structures, like being able to see the analogies where one domain of knowledge, talk about interdisciplinarity here, one domain of knowledge has a certain logical structure to it, and trying to see analogously how you can find a similar structure going on in a different domain. And that's actually super useful if you want to try to bring together things like computer science or neuroscience and history or literature. Like there are underlying abstract structures that you can start to pull together. Philosophers are not the only people who can do this, of course not, but that is something we're actually trained in, is to start to think about these kind of abstract logical structures, see the analogies, etc. So that's the big picture, super abstracted account of what we're trying to do. Let me give you a couple examples of what that looks like in practice. And I'm not going to get like, my prepared remarks right now are not like about specifically about the topic of this panel, but it's to give you a setup of how I'm thinking about the topic we're going to start discussing together. It has to do with online disinformation. So it's kind of related to content moderation. It's the same area. And it has to do just like two examples of how these philosophical techniques are helpful. So one has to do with the idea of foresight. So I mentioned before, the McEwan analogy is drive out ahead of everybody else, be seeing what's coming up ahead. How do you do that? Well, one way to do that is to, you read, so what I do is I'm reading different tech reports from people, mostly journalists, sometimes people working directly in technology saying, here's this new thing we're just starting to see at trade shows. Nobody knows how to use it yet commercially, but it's this cool new application of a technology. And then I start thinking, okay, fast forward 10 years. Imagine a society where this is more widely used commercially. Start trying to imagine what kind of effects that has, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody does this when they're trying to do foresight. I'm not trying to claim philosophers in particular can do this. But I'm suggesting that like one nice thing about philosophy is it gives us a little bit of leeway. We're allowed to do this. Like the downside of philosophy is we don't have data. I don't have data to show you. I don't have slides. But the flexibility is it lets you start seeing ahead. So here's the example I promised you. Deepfakes. So right now, everybody talks about deepfakes, these AI-generated images and videos that appear to depict events that things people never actually did or said appear, they're depicted in deepfakes, right? And I first started working on deepfakes about 7 or so years ago, and at the time, I was really irritated that when people talked about it, all they seemed to be able to imagine was the obvious harmful effect. The obvious harmful effect is some bad actor creates a fake video of some famous figure saying something bad. Right? And people fall for it. People fall for it. People fall for the deception. But there's a second order effect of that, which I think today we're mostly starting to appreciate, which is that the possibility of deceptive deepfakes makes people distrust all media. And then we get this like really broader epistemic erosion of the regulating effect on public discourse that reliable recordings used to provide. Okay? And I think today, in 2024, people are starting to get that point. This isn't like me like saying, oh, I'm so clever, I'm so smart, but I wrote about that 7 years ago, that was coming. And it was because of our training in epistemology. Thinking about how justification works, how people reason together, how they convince each other of things, and without going into a whole talk right now about the relationship between recording and memory and reasoning, using some of the resources of philosophy, I was able to think ahead about there's a predictable second order effect of the first order effect of fabricated media. So that's one example. Second example has to do with basically like trying to think, what's the term I want? Sympathetic reasoning is the term I want. Okay, sympathetic reasoning. It's looking at a social phenomenon that appears on the surface to be irrational, and then trying to imagine yourself in the subject position of the seemingly irrational person and see, like, actually, why does that make sense? Why is that a smart thing to do? So the second example here has to do with partisanship and testimony reception. So on social media, a big problem is that people tend to seemingly believe all sorts of nonsense. They believe incredibly implausible fake news. I don't just mean like the kind of stuff where, that could have happened, but it hasn't been verified yet. I mean like just bizarre stuff that seems to defy basic laws of human psychology, and you wouldn't think anybody would believe it, but some people apparently do believe it. And part of the explanation for that to some extent has to do with partisanship. That is, I see somebody who's on my side saying it, and I give more credence to that person than I would to somebody on the other side or a neutral party. And a lot of people looking at this is 10 years ago now, people looking at this would say that's irrational, Like your partisan co-identification, that has nothing to do with whether the claim is true or not. But when you start thinking about this internally through this sympathetic rationality, you start to realize, actually, from a subject position, the people who you think are usually right are your co-partisans. Usually, the people who are trustworthy, who usually say things you'll end up thinking by your own lights are true, are the people who are already part of your social group. And so actually, it makes sense individually to be a partisan about testimony reception. That doesn't make sense at a social level. It's a collective rationality problem. Put it all together and you've got people in their own little partisan encampments being selectively attentive to information, depending on whether it serves their partisan purposes. That is not good. That is not good for collective reasoning. But at an individual level, it is individually rational. It's individually reasonable. And failing to appreciate that there actually is a reasonableness at the individual level means you misdiagnose the problem. So anyway, those are two examples of the kind of work I've done in the past, which are about thinking about foresight by modeling, like second-order effects of epistemic structure. And the second example is about what can you get out of modeling in your own head, the subjective rationality of a person in that kind of position. And now I'm looking forward to talking more about the future of some of these technologies. So thank you so much.
Wow, that's awesome. Professor Ahmed, you're up.
Thank you. It's always difficult to talk after like two great talks. So I also don't have slides, but I'll share with you two stories from two communities that I have been working with in the last 5 years. And I'm a computer scientist, so I build computer systems, and I try to make computer systems fairer and working for marginalized communities. One community that I have been working for the last 15 years as a poor, marginalized, and kind of stigmatized groups in Bangladesh, where I am from. And the second group that I've been working last 7 to 8 years are the immigrant communities from Global South who are now here in North America. So I'll tell you two stories which will tell you two important problems that we are now struggling with to make content moderation on social media fairer. And I also want to mention that this problem of content moderation, the aspect of this problem, the content moderation that we are working on, has a lot of similarities with the challenges of data annotation problem in machine learning and data science. So you get a data, then you need people to tell you what the data is about. And that's where you also take opinions from other people. That's how you actually get the data. Anyway, so I'll tell you the stories. Both of the stories are about social media content moderation. The first story is from Bangladesh, and here I'll be talking about the challenges with actually implementing representation. So this story started 10 years ago when the government of Bangladesh, made it compulsory for every Facebook users to connect their Facebook account with their national ID. So the government exactly knows who you are, and if you write something on social media that they don't like, they can talk to you. So that's not like a very good news for citizens of Bangladesh. There have been lots of criticisms around, but then the government also told the media that they are doing that to protect the voice of the communities. So it's not like they are going to curtail their voice, but they will protect the voice. So anyway, so that's when I started looking into this problem, how silencing actually works, and a lot of my work was around these issues of silencing on social media, where this content moderation is not actually coming from a single person, but it's basically a power exercise. And that power is a complex equation, formed by multiple parties, government, these tech platforms, and also kind of like the economic distribution of the people who are in power, who say what. So when the content moderation first started by Facebook, so in Bangladesh, most of the people, they use Facebook. This is like a main social media that they use. The content moderation, when it started with a community standard guidelines set by our friends sitting in Silicon Valley here in California, who have zero knowledge about Bangladesh. So posts which were like being leveled and reported to them, those were then judged and moderated by the people who probably never read a thing about Bangladesh, and a lot of problems started to happen. Then they said, okay, no, we're now going to recruit people from that region to moderate the contents coming from that region. That sounded, like a good idea, but it's not. It's actually even more problematic. So first of all, there are so many Bangladeshis sitting in different parts of the world, so it's difficult from that perspective. But even if you find people from Bangladesh, who are the people that you are trying to find? And turns out that, this Bengali-speaking people, some of them live in India, some of them living in Bangladesh. So, since India is a richer country, more power, they recruited those moderators from India, who again do not have that much knowledge about Bangladesh, and again, all Bangladeshi contents. No matter what, if this have any, a strong words in it, those would get reported, flagged, and people, their voices were marginalized. Then we protested. There were a written application to Facebook to have people from Bangladesh, so a more representation. Okay, then they recruited people from Bangladesh. Soon we found that there are some private companies started forming who were providing this service of content moderation. They were recruiting young people who are looking for jobs, and they become content moderators. It's not a very high-paying job. And that job is not a very pleasant job. Your job from morning to evening is to look a lot of offensive stuff and level them is actually offensive or not. And sometimes you also write explanation why it is a bad post and should be removed. And in a scale of 1 to 10, you rate the post, and that's your job, morning to evening. It's not for a mental health. So then. There a lot of writing, and they think, okay, and even then, these people, young people that they recruited, they also didn't have a knowledge about a lot of things, so they were going to internet to find what is truth. And internet, as you know, they don't have a lot of information about Bangladesh. So again, the same kind of problem kept happening. And then every time we started having this conversation with Facebook, the answer was, you need more representation. So the problem is looking at this moderation problem from the lens of representation itself is problematic. So one obvious, a criticism and, a suggestion that, alternative suggestion that we get, why don't we, approach this problem from more, a social justice point of view. It's kind of a Rawls way of, looking at this problem from the most marginalized person in the community, and then, see, whether it's good for them or bad for them, and based on that, you level the content. The problem is that the people who are most marginalized in the community, they have no, sometimes they have no reason to fix the content over social media. That's not their job. And you cannot just drag them to this job to make your platform fairer. So here is this whole problem of alienation that we are finding with content moderation. The people who are moderating the content, how much stake do they have in making the platform like Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media to make these platforms fairer? And if they really do have a stake there, an interest there, an agenda there, are we aligning that agenda with the Facebook's or these platforms, a profit-generating agenda? Unless or until we fix that, I think this way of fixing the problem of content moderation by representation is will be very difficult. So this is the problem that we are still working on. Okay, story number 2. This story is from the immigrant communities here in Toronto that we have been working for last 5 years. The project actually started before pandemic, but during pandemic, we found this problem became severer. The problem was, the problem statement was easy, like online hate content. And during pandemic, a lot of hate content that we saw or posted on social media against Asian population, people who are from China, people also in India, there are lots of this kind of hate content against Muslim people. So this Islamophobia and anti-Chinese, opposed were on rise during COVID pandemic. So then we try to, go deeper into the problem. We started working with the 2 communities based in Toronto with the help of 2 nonprofits to actually, find the solution. So they were the people who were, so we collected the data, we sampled, and they were leveling the data. And oftentimes there are even debates among these people who are moderating the data. For example, if there is a criticism about the Chinese government, is it like a hatred toward China, or is it like a valid criticism of the a government? So they were debating on that, and then we found that okay. So the suggestion was that we need to make this platform, the content moderation, plural, pluriversal. We have to accommodate different voices. So that was the motto. So we said, okay, let's do that. Try to find out what is, how we can accommodate as many voices as possible in content moderation. So then we find out that it basically broke the moderator groups. So within the moderator groups, there are so every time we sat down with them for the meeting, there is a fight, there is a quarrel. Even online, we are maintaining a Slack channel for that. They were fighting with each other. And at some point we found that to fix the online problem, we actually made their this offline community better. So you cannot, it's ideally, it's very easy to say that you put 2 or 3 opinions together, but holding a moderator panel and actually implementing that is a huge challenge. So again, I don't have solutions for any of these 2 problems. So I'm adding 2 more problems to the discussion. Thank you.
I mean, content moderation is many things, but it's definitely not boring. We have Taylor Swift lyrics, we have Marshall McLuhan driving the wrong way down the highway or speeding, and of course we have this content moderation fight in real life. I mean, it's an exciting topic. But I want to get back to a really basic question. I want to take this opportunity to ask a few prepared questions. And we've sort of taken for granted what content moderation is. We've all hinted at it. Maybe it's somebody taking down my aunt's conspiracy posts. Maybe it's somebody in a mom group deleting, honey posts. But content moderation can be a lot of things. I'm curious for each of you, and perhaps Professor McEwan, you want to start. What really is content moderation? What are we talking about here?
Well, that's a great question. So of course, there is a lot of different ways to go about it. But I think that when we're talking about content moderation, you really can kind of dig into the root word of moderate, right? Which is to change the message in some way that is more palatable to the group, right? And I think one thing that kind of struck me across the talks is that we talk a lot about the sender who's sending the message, and we talk a lot about the channel that's conveying the message, but gosh, the message means different things depending on who the receiver is, right, and who the audience is. And so the moderation is meant to make it to be a more appropriate message for the audience, but of course it's going to matter a lot on who that audience is believed to be.
you want to add to that, Professor Rini?
Sure, yeah, I absolutely agree that like the audience matters a lot. One metaphor I find helpful is filtration. It's basically like a sieve that signals are going through. One analogy that is helpful here, Zoom. We've all experienced being on Zoom, I think. Zoom has a kind of audio filtration thing that's meant to like siphon out background noise. So I discovered when I was in meetings with colleagues that like, I happened to be that they were like, somebody was jackhammering in the building I lived in at the time, and so I could just hear this immense jackhammer noise, and none of my colleagues could hear that. And so it seemed like I was just like pointlessly shouting at them, but I was just trying to speak loud enough that I could hear myself. And so that's because of the sonic filtration, some sort of algorithm Zoom is running that filters out anything that doesn't sound like a human voice. On the other hand, one time I tried to play music for my students at the beginning of a Zoom meeting, just to like make things more friendly or whatever. And I didn't realize it was filtering out, I was playing some recording, the Zoom audio thing was filtering out any part of the music that wasn't a human voice. And so they were getting this weird chopped up clip. It was super weird, and like it freaked them all out because I didn't explain what I was doing. Okay, so that's an example of how filtration, depending upon the purpose it's being used for, can be helpful or really bad. And so I think content moderation is a lot like that. Filtration for content moderation is sometimes as simple as just getting rid of spam, right? Like most social media platforms, if they had zero content moderation, would just be utterly unusable because they would just be full of spam. Spam would greatly outnumber the actual human-generated content. And so then the question is just like, once we start, where do we place the filtration level between the spam bottom dwellers and like where we want to start cutting off actual substantive human-based content that is somehow not useful for the particular audience. And so I think, yeah, coming back to the audience is really, really important.
So my definition of content moderation might differ a bit from both of you, because the way I see content moderation is happening, I agree that, there are like lots of things I don't like. I don't want to be on social media. A lot of people don't want to be on social media, but those things don't get moderated. For example, like on Twitter, I might not want to see Elon Musk's tweets, but I cannot kick him out. So it's basically, one definition that, I heard from one of the government people in Bangladesh who was explaining me what content moderation is. I don't like the person, but I found that his definition was actually made a lot of sense because he was saying that we don't care about content, we care about the media. So it's basically platform moderation. We try to make sure Facebook doesn't make a trouble. So it's like, the same thing that if I post, if the content, and if that is posted by Elon Musk, who cares about what I post, but the audience and other stuff. So even if in social media, there is already a lot of, an useless, stuff people are posting every single day. People, the moderators are not, that much bothered about that. It's about when it is threatening the power, when it is asking, the question, it's pushing the boundary, only then they make sure that, so it's not only about the content, it's about, whether that media is becoming a threat to the power. And for me, content moderation is making sure that the platform is not causing a lot of trouble.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's competing definitions, but I think right now, and I think Professor Rini, you're probably the right person to ask this first to, is we're talking about this idea, but the concerns probably could be more tangible. Like, what do you see right now as the most pressing concerns? You hinted about deepfakes, but what's next? Like, what's the next thing we should be concerned about when we're talking about this?
Yeah, so the thing I'm worried about right now is the shift in social media from social graph to psychograph. And I know some people will know what I'm talking about, but not everybody will, so maybe just briefly explain this. So old-fashioned social media, old-fashioned from 10 years ago, was based upon the social graph. The idea was that what the platform is looking at is your position on some map of your social relationships, your friends, your coworkers, your family, whatever. And that was part of what defined you as a node in this network. But what's increasingly changed, mostly because of TikTok, although all the other companies are chasing them now and trying to do the same, is that you're defined not necessarily by your social position, but rather by some sort of psychological profile. That is, what sorts of basically sensory stimuli do you respond to? So TikTok really revolutionized this in using basically an algorithm that's sensitive to how long do you watch certain types of videos, where the crucial variables aren't just the surface content of the video, but also things like, what is like the ratio of uplifting sounds to downbeat sounds in the audio track, like things like really basic sensory stuff, which remarkably is actually much older than the social graph. This goes back to behaviorist psychology in the 1950s. So B.F. Skinner, the Harvard psychologist who wrote a book in 1971 called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and who argued in that book that the only way we would save the world from nuclear devastation was to not care about freedom and dignity anymore, and instead just treat people as like those experimental pigeons and rats in his labs at Harvard, who you would use shocks and treat pellets to get them to do right things. He said, that's what we need for humanity, or else we're all going to die. And that's B.F. Skinner. This is quite old now. And back then, in the mid-20th century, people were worried about brainwashing using this kind of behaviorist technology. My increasing worry is that what looked like absurd science fiction in the 1950s was absurd science fiction in the 1950s, but may not be absurd science fiction for too much longer. The kinds of psychographic technology being developed right now, I'm not saying TikTok can do this right now, but I'm trying to do the McEwan thing of driving a bit ahead and thinking a little bit farther, 10 years down the road. The kind of psychographic profiling that social media companies are racing each other and spending billions of dollars right now to become better at are going to start approaching the kinds of psychographic manipulations that Skinner pioneered in the 1950s, but at a genuinely effective scale. That scares me. I don't know exactly what bad actors would do with that technology. Remember, the point is to try to drive ahead and think ahead about where things are going. And I wish I knew. So that I see that as the number one challenge right now, is like, how do the platforms and also how does civil society and governance think about what kind of decisions we're going to come to? What are the rules about when you're allowed to use this technology, for what purpose, who decides? And given that it's all mediated through black box machine learning systems, does any particular human even exactly know what it's doing? Anyway, that's my answer to your question.
It's a terrifying answer, but it's accurate. Professor McEwan, do you want to add to that? Do you have some thoughts?
Sorry, I was still with the pigeons in the. Can you remind me exactly what the question was?
What's next? Like, what should we be concerned about next? Like, Professor Ree's outlined this very dystopian view, which I think I agree with, honestly, but there's a lot of challenges we're going to face next. Like, what do you think is the next big challenge here?
Okay, so one thing is that it's very easy to look at how fast the media environment changed in the last 20 years and to go, oh my gosh, this is so dystopian now because of all of the things that we talked about in our talks. But I also think sometimes my dad will say once in a while, like, he wants a return to the smoke-filled rooms. And you'll be like, wait, what? And what he's saying is he wants a return to when men, because it was men, got together and made decisions, and then there was a public announcement of that decision from these powerful men, because it served, like, my dad is a white man, right? Like, that serves him in a particular way. And it's kind of an interesting way to think about, like, well, I didn't have to worry about all those things. The messaging was very clean, right? The audience was very decided. There was 3 channels. I'm old enough to have grown up with an antenna that you turned like this, and if it froze in the winter, you were stuck on ABC all winter. And that was your news. And so, right, so you didn't have to weed through all of this messaging and all of these things. So I'm always sort of like, well, obviously when you started adding in all of these channels and all of these different, like, obviously it's messy. But I'm not entirely sure that it's worse, because we're now engaging with the messiness of being human in a very different way. And I can disagree perhaps with folks that I grew up with in a small rural town, but gosh, they're politically engaged in a way that their parents never were, right? So I guess I'm kind of flipping it to, like, I do worry about trust in particular. The bit that you said about the problem with the deepfakes is not that you'll be like, oh, that's fake, but it'll be like, anyone can say anything is fake now, right? And nothing is necessarily believable. I do worry about that, like, that level of nihilism in information. because then that makes it difficult to do anything else that has to do with communication. But I'm not entirely sure we're just on this like road to ruin. It's just that it's messy. The network got exponentially bigger, and so the problems became exponentially more visible.
Professor Rini, do you want to respond to that? It's sort of in contrast to this rat view you've painted for us.
I mean, the way to fix that is to put us all back in the cages, right?
Yeah, I'll hold off for the moment.
Okay. Well, yeah. So I have just like a question, so I really like this Skinner, like a story. So for like a social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter, who wants to like profile every single individuals, it's important for them to actually like a better model that person, that that person acts freely. So if the content moderation is not actually helping that person, so I guess like the line of argument goes that is there any inherent interest in these platforms to make content moderation, or do they actually, it's more helpful for them to allow people to post whatever they want? Would they get like a more valuable data in that?
Yeah, it's right. I mean, you're asking the right question, right? Because we have to think about what is the motivation for the platform, what is the motivation for the users, what's the motivation for government or civil society regulators, and yeah, the tricky thing is that what really scares me is that bad actors who aren't actually the platforms themselves figure this out faster than the platforms do, and figure out ways to reverse engineer a psychographic content moderation system to be able to basically do, this is gonna sound like very 1950s science fiction, but subliminal propaganda. Like again, it sounds crazy to say it. Like people were absurd about this in the 1950s, but like we have machine learning technology now that makes it a lot less absurd. And so that's the worry I have, is that like content moderation systems that were intended to actually serve the benefit of the users, or at least serve the benefit of the corporate platform that wants to sell their eyeballs to advertisers, will in fact be harnessed by a third party who has figured out how to reverse engineer the system through their own seemingly innocuous content to accomplish something else. That scares me. Again, I don't know how to do it. Thank goodness I don't know how to do it. But that scares me that somebody will figure it out.
Well, and I don't know if we're at the level of the code that's doing the moderating, but at the level of picking the right messages in the right way, the trolls already know how to do it, right? And I use that as a broad term, but I'm thinking of those, those kind of 4chan users, the folks who were around in late 90s, early 2000s. And if you look at some of Whitney Phillips' work, she's got a great book, This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. But she also has this one little article called Meet the Trolls, and she goes and she interviews a guy that she'd found on 4chan and has this sort of interesting conversation with him. And in his mind, he's fixing the media system. And I don't know that that's terribly wrong either. Their goal was to create these, wild things, the sort of, the rainbow parties and that kind of stuff, and then get Oprah to talk about it. And so that way they could point at the system and go, look, the real news media picks up all this fake news, and we just made that up. Now everybody can see how ridiculous that is. But the problem was it never got to the point that the general audience was like, oh, that was ridiculous. They were like, oh, kids are eating Tide Pods, right? And so you have this kind of, you have users out there who already know how to disrupt, at least. Whether or not we're talking about, are we organized enough to create a coalition around something, to create a movement about something, we still seem to be focused more on destruction than creation. But you can see various entities using the kind of Facebook groups mechanism to create groups. I remember I was in Chicago during the George Floyd protests, right? And you have all these fake Black Lives Matters groups pushing things into people's news feeds that were ridiculous and awful, things like, we'll kill all the white people. But then people who were already kind of afraid of a Black Lives Matter movement could go, look at what Black Lives Matter wants to do. No one in the BLM movement wanted to do that, right? But so this being able to create that and then having that difficulty of being able to tell who was the source of that, but just fitting in a little bit with what was already kind of in that latitude of acceptance, right? That's Sharif, 1947, I want to say. That latitude of acceptance can kind of just push you further and further into a polarized position. And so, you know, on the mechanism side, how do you deter? You can, right? Like you can kind of determine where those messages are coming, where they're geotagged from, et cetera, but it is a lot of work on the platform's side to be able to say, we want to have this message. And if you have enough bad actors in a particular system, then it just destroys the platform for everyone else. And so when we think about something like free speech, it is just as detrimental to speech to not moderate as it is to moderate, because then a platform gets overrun with actors who are just trying to drown everything else out.
That transitions really well into my sort of final prepared question before I move back to the room. It gives me an opportunity to plug a panel moderated by Kelly Lyons on Wednesday about the global public opinion of AI, a new forthcoming report by SRI that I've helped work on. And we asked a question to about 26,000 people around the world about who should do content moderation. And we find a surprising number of people are looking for tech companies to do that moderation. I'm curious, Professor Ahmed, your read of that. Obviously, bring up the Bangladesh example. How do you see this? Who really should be doing the content moderation?
Gosh. Tough question. Only if I knew the answer.
10 words or less, answer.
Well, so to be fair, I think it's the community who are being affected should ideally do their content moderation. But I also believe that these communities are not, are not in a position to serve this platform. So I guess like a whole, like a movement around transformative justice is needed here. It's not just we can, find people, assign them tasks. This thing will not work in that way. There should be like a change around the structure of the society in the community. And I guess like some lessons that we learned when these public broadcast systems were being deployed in North America, 100 years ago, how the community actually had their own mechanisms around who will talk about if something is broadcasted from television or radio, who are the people who will talk about that, and in different levels how that news will be perceived. We don't have that on social media these days, and this is something that has to come from the communities. So if you ask me who should moderate the content, as always for me, the communities, the affected communities should be allowed to moderate the content.
Wait, can I ask you a question? Can you do that at scale?
Yeah. So here's my problem with the scale. So why do you, okay, so I build computer systems, so definitely I can help a bit with scaling, but then again, we don't want to make something generalized and ubiquitous because ethics is a political thing. We don't want to apply one person's ethics on another person or one group's ethics on another group. So that kind of like a scaling of an ethical decision is actually problematic, and it's actually by definition it's colonialism. You impose your idea on other people, so that I don't want to do.
But then how big are the communities? Because you said something that sounds on surface like who could disagree with it? It should be the communities regulating themselves, but like as soon as a community is more than like one person, there's going to be some colonialism on the way you've just described it, because someone's going to impose their standard on somebody else. So like, are the communities all just one person? They can't be.
No. So okay, so that's actually an excellent question. So this is basically like the question of democracy.
Yeah.
So is it a perfect system? No, but it's probably better than any other alternatives. So the way I was thinking about this content moderation, it's not also it will also have a lot of this kind of limitations, but that's probably the least a problematic version of it. So how the representation will come from like all the members through their representatives, it may vary from different communities based on scale and all these things. But without this restructuring, this kind of mechanism, it's probably, I don't see any other way how we can bring the voice of people.
We have one exemplar, right, of where that kind of model works, and it's Wikipedia. And but that being said, like
But the literature. In Wikipedia too, there are like so many debates.
There's also there's a ton of problems within Wikipedia itself, but I would say also like Wikipedia comes under attack, like when Wikimedia was here, they were at Toronto Public Library and they had a bomb threat, and also that was like the exact week that the Toronto Public Library went down, unconnected but maybe connected, and so it's really hard because there's a power structure throughout the whole thing.
Yep.
Right, and so I always kind of shy away from the idea that like the corporate platforms should be the ones in charge of the moderation of speech, right? Stan Dietz's book, Democracy in the Age of Corporate Colonization, kind of feeds some of my thoughts in that area. Though he doesn't talk a lot about technology, but he's like, where's going to be the forum for these decisions that corporations make? And so then it feels like there should be some sort of government regulatory process. But you're right in that where online trust and safety and content moderation does best is in groups that have some diversity, because otherwise you end up with attitude consistent online communities, which is not Wikipedia, because oh my gosh, if you want people who can have an argument, wiki editors. But have some standard of rightness. They might be arguing that standard, but they can do it because the group's not so huge. And I think you see this a bit in like kind of TikTok comments and things too, where people will kind of have these arguments in sort of smaller groups. But when it gets to be a really, really large group, it's hard. And we have some data on Reddit that looked at when people when they used words, it was a natural language processing kind of study. So when they had communities that kind of were sort of stable and coherent, they were more satisfied with those communities as well. And it's this curvilinear relationship. So if it gets too big, then it doesn't work because we've blown up the audience and there's all these other influences and nobody feels connected to anybody else. But there is this kind of middle ground where it does seem to work.
True. One difference though, so in Wikipedia, the information is often, like a thought as not attached to any person. So you go to a Wikipedia article, we don't think that someone said this, but on social media, you always, attach content with a person, and who said what is a very important, like a question there. The reason why, the moderators care about moderating the platform and these contents is about who is saying that. And this is where the thing gets, problematic and beyond the scope of natural language processing, because it's not in the content, but it's in the context, I guess.
Yeah, no, this particular study was looking at words about like coherence and things. It wasn't looking for like moderation through natural language processing. So I would agree with that I would not moderate things through looking for word choices, because that's not how communication works, right? Like we restructure things all the time to get around those particular rules.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm probably getting too much time. So one project that I'm now doing is about, I'm working with this, communities who care about an internal disputes among Muslims about different Quranic verses. And so if you put that in this most sophisticated natural language processing, an algorithm and, an ChatGPT, you still don't find any women's voice in it, because historically women were not the, a priest or so even the verses from from Bible, from Quran, from Torah, we are starting. So the how do you actually bring those voices to these interpretations? Actually, is not a very easy an NLP problem to solve, a context like in history, so a lot of like machine learning is about data from the past. It's kind of like a problem with historical determinism that, like for hundreds of years we have been criticizing. It's happening here. But the main problem is that if you don't have that in history is biased, then what do you do with this, like even moderation, strategies with technology? Sorry, I'll leave it to it.
That's great. It's a very exciting debate. I mean, we have two content moderators here right now. We have Alice and Ram, who are moderating our online content. And I was wondering if you could perhaps ask a question from the online context here for our group.
So I'm going to try to paraphrase the question. Hopefully that still... Yes, exactly. So the question is about incentives. So one thought might be that given the economic value that the social media companies get, maybe they're the ones that should put in now the resources to create a safe or productive space online. So the thought that the community together should be the content moderator is nice, but there's also cost to it. So maybe the reason why in the survey so many people think that it's the social media company that should do the content moderation has actually to do with the cost. So it's something that actually is a responsibility. It incurs cost rather than who has the power to do the moderation. Hopefully that's an accurate paraphrasing of the question in the chat.
Yeah, I like that question because it separates two things. One is who makes the kind of, let's roughly call it regulatory, right? Who makes the regulatory decisions about what could and should be moderated and puts the locus of that decision in one spot, and then who pays for the resources to make that decision and puts the locus of that in another spot, right? Which is possible to do. We often conflate both, like the person who's paying should be the one getting to decide, but actually when you're, influencing the public sphere at scale, maybe you don't also get to decide. And we used to do that, right? You used to, for whether you liked the rules or didn't like the rules, right? There was things you couldn't say on television kind of thing. And there was a reason for a long, long time, Zuckerberg would say, oh, we're a tech company, not a media company, because media companies have different regulations, right? And so there is that kind of idea of, yeah, we could, have some idea of what the regulation should be, and then you have to, implement that. But I think I can hear it in Ahmed's head already, right? Like I can hear it of like, yeah, but who's going to decide that regulation, right? Before you even get to implementing it, and that is where we are at, right? Like, because that is a huge locus of power within the society. Who gets to decide what that regulatory frame is?
Also, tech company does give money to the third parties for this content moderation. So they are giving money, they are giving resources. It's still not working.
Yeah. What worry I have, and it's a good distinction between who pays and who decides what the standards are. But the problem is we have a historical model for that, which is the Film Censorship Board that regulated Hollywood for the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and weeded out anything that was deemed to be obscene or was deemed to be pro-communist propaganda. Subversive. And so like that really worries me, that like the trend of this conversation tends towards we want some sort of state oversight of whatever the incentive structure is, but like that's a magnet for people who want to just clamp down on viewpoints they don't want to have represented in society. So it's not just that like it might like this machinery might accidentally get taken up by people wanting to control authoritarians. It might get taken up by authoritarians. It's not just an accident, it's a magnet to them. It attracts authoritarians. That's especially true of the early regulation of radio in Europe in the 1930s. There's been like studies of this basically about the effectiveness of the German state in the 1930s in gaining control of content regulation on radio. And so that really scares me, that like if we start thinking about this in terms of state regulation of these systems, that's actually worse than allowing the profit-seeking corporations, because it will attract really bad actors. And I've realized, that's just me saying, let's foreclose the most obvious good strategy here, but I do worry that like sometimes what looks like the promising good strategy is actually worse than the bad strategy we have right now.
Do we have any more questions in the room? Perhaps.
Thanks, and thanks for a great panel. Maybe you could all say a little bit more about how you see the connection between business models and technical affordances, because in my mind, right, so there are examples of social media platforms, or at least social platforms, right, that seem to have avoided some of these toxic imbroglios, and it seems like they're the ones that don't try to make any money. Now, it doesn't mean that the ones that don't try to make any money also don't have problems, but there's seems to be some connection between, right? So one story that I tend to think is partially true, right, is that why does Facebook act the way it does? Well, Facebook, even though it doesn't like things that it doesn't like being accused of fostering hate speech and whatever, they do want eyeballs, right? They want attention. And so if attention involves connecting you to all your closest friends who are rapidly talking about QAnon, they're going to do that, right? So that's a business model decision. That's not necessarily an affordance decision. So I guess maybe I'll stop there. Yeah, how do you see those connections, if at all? And how does it really define moderation?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, what I have seen is that the platforms, they don't care. I mean, because it's the regulations and laws that they have to do that. But if there is a bad content and a lot of people are watching that, and then they'll be very happy with that. My answer would be like they don't care. So they try to do the bare minimum, and then they do that in a very bad way. Yeah.
I think you're right. The system is designed to get as many eyeballs as possible. So there is a level of where they do start to care, because if a space becomes just awful, so the one example here is Twitter, right? Like, so when the space starts to become awful, you do lose a lot of users, but like, it still survives, right? Like, we're still advertising this conference on Twitter, right? So there's a point for platforms of where they should care, right? To be able to maintain that advertising revenue, if that's what they're, kind of based on. And so you can kind of see, this is where Mark's statement after the 2016 election that we're going to have spaces that are like more comfortable for you makes a lot of sense, because if I can get your news feed to not show you the people you disagree with, and can get you into these online communities that are the things that you're asking for, then then I keep more eyeballs on the site, and I keep more users.
But comfortable means the thing you agree with.
Yeah.
Right. So like,
it doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be true.
Or fitting any kind of value system that we might suggest would be a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the populist one.
Yeah.
And I think TikTok does this particularly well, right? As you were saying, like they serve you up exactly what they kind of think that you want to see, and then they serve you more and more of that. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if it's accurate or if it's good for society. And then I'm trying to remember what the issue was, but there was some political issue recently that I realized I was getting like shoved just a little bit of stuff on TikTok, and it was coming through like horses and kittens and Taylor Swift videos, right? I know I blame the kids, but still. So, right? And then I was like, wait, I don't think that. And then it started like speeding faster through those particular kinds of videos, but I realized I was like, that's the trick, right? Get you hooked on this, and this, and then if we just want to shove your idea a little bit this way and understand, that latitude of rejection, because that's what we see when people post messages that are low quality and very polarized, and the other side goes, oh my gosh, we could never believe that, and we can't talk to each other at all. And that was the mechanism with like the Black Lives Matter group. But the TikTok thing is much more, if I can start to serve you up some messages that I know you're here, and I'm just gonna push you a little this way, and then a little more this way, and a little more this way, then I can change your opinion. And
Yeah, no, this is like the relatively easy to see version of what I meant by subliminal propaganda. Like, but like I'm scared of it getting much more complicated, where it's harder to detect consciously what's happening. But notice how it relates to this question about the profit motive and the business model, which is like you said, after 2016, Facebook said it wanted to be about family and happy experiences on Facebook. And I believe the claim was we're going to try to reduce politics on the Facebook feed and make it more about like family photos and stuff. And that didn't last very long, because then Facebook started chasing the TikTok model. And now the standard Facebook algorithm actually deprioritizes the social graph and deprioritizes your family and your friends relative to whatever like 90-second video is showing the most numbers for people not scrolling away quickly. And that's the TikTok model. And so like there isn't any principled basis for how these big corporations are making the choices right now. They're just chasing after whatever is the newest thing that gets the greatest amount of engagement over time. And that's worrying.
We have time for one more question. Maybe we should go to Hayani over here.
So following up from all of this, it seems that outrage is what gets a lot of eyeballs. And what do you think it would take for us to move away from outrage as our new default sort of emotional mode in society?
Is it? I wonder if it's still true. Actually, I'm curious what you all think about this. Because my impression is that TikTok, this is one thing TikTok has done that might be good or might be more insidious, which is actually that outrage doesn't play as well on TikTok as it does on more traditional social media. That it's more, that the overall emotional tenor of TikTok is more positive, but then it can be used to anyway, I'm curious what you all think about this. Is that true?
Well, so we have been starting some social media content creators for last couple of years. So sometimes they have to work against the algorithm because they know the platform algorithm may not choose their content because that content has this and that. So they first start their content with something else, and then they actually go to their content. So it's a very complex negotiation between the content creators, platform, government, and definitely the users, because the way you are watching those contents also influence the platform algorithms.
Maybe sometimes we should be outraged. Maybe that's part of it too, right? We see a lot more of the overall story of the world than we used to. We can see a lot of the effects of things that we're a part of in the democracies that we're a part of, but maybe didn't realize. I'm thinking of the panel we just had, right? We see a lot more kind of things in the world that we couldn't view before, and now we can. The issue becomes when the outrage is so easy to activate, but the information isn't true, right? Then we get into this we're right back to the beginning of this sort of like deepfakes and what can we trust and what's the sort of information literacy, although I hesitate to use literacy because it's not quite the right frame. But I think sometimes this particular media environment might be an anomaly. This might be the kind of only time in the human experience that we have access to this much information and this much kind of control over getting more information, because we're already starting to see this being pulled back under the guise of safety and content moderation, right? And so in some ways, if we want to be able to maintain access to understanding more about the world than we've ever been able to understand before, even though it's problematic and it's messy and our aunts post weird things on Facebook and right, then we have to just live in the messy, right? And we have to kind of be a part of the world in that way.
So we're cognizant of time. We have about 3 minutes left. I want to give each of you like 30 seconds to 45 seconds just to tell us, you know, if you're in this room, maybe this is a new topic for you, or you're more of a computer scientist, and now you're thinking about content moderation. What would you recommend that our listeners here and the people paying attention would be interested in reading or listening to or subscribing to? What piece of media would you recommend, whether it's your own work, your own book, good time to plug that, or other work you're doing? What would you recommend that people here read or listen to? Press from McEwan first. Sorry.
Tufekci's Twitter and tear gas comes to mind.
Stole
it. These are kind of Twitter pieces, so they're a little bit out of date now, but hashtag activism by Bailey Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells. We're working on something right now, so I should have that one. Those are really good pieces. I also go back to some of the older social theory. Like I always recommend Dietz's Democracy in the Age of Corporate Colonization, which is an organizational communication kind of book, but spells out a lot of what has happened in the last 20 years.
That's awesome. Professor Rini?
I'll recommend you 2 novels. One is by Jennifer Egan. It's called The Candy House. It's from about 2 years ago. Both of these novelists have past precedent in predicting the future. If you go back to Egan's novel from a decade ago called The Visit from the Goon Squad, she foresaw some of social media's effects. And this one's more about, The Candy House is more about machine learning and media. Anyway, so it's really interesting. Second novel I recommend for you is by Neil Stephenson, who became famous for 30 years ago, getting to the idea of the metaverse, which as he has pointed out to interviewers since, was not meant to be an inspiration, but rather a dystopian warning. But nevertheless, here we are, here's the metaverse. In his 2019 novel, which is titled Fall, he explores, it's a very long novel, and you don't need to read the whole thing to understand what I'm getting at, but in the first third of the novel, there's this amazing scenario where he tries to imagine what it would be to try to intervene and stop the spread of disinformation online by corroding the epistemic pipelines of the internet, and it goes very badly in a really fascinating way. So if you wanted to get a mind-expanding take on what that would mean, I recommend the first 300 pages or so of the novel Fall.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things that coming to my mind, things that I read and made sense. One is definitely Durkheim's earlier work with a sacred and profane, how society made these two things with how this is political. The other one is this Garfinkel's work on degradation, how this degradation ceremony, how some data from this place become bad in another place. So how that happens, if you change the context, degradation happens. And then a very recent work, the name of the book is Discard Studies, Wasting Systems and Power, a book by Josh Lepolsky and Max Liboiron. So they are also making this argument that the West, or what is discarded, is an absolute decision by power. It's a question of power, and there is nothing absolute like an objective there. So I guess this scholarship in this line has helped me and probably help others.
That was awesome. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful panel, sometimes scary, but always interesting. Please give a warm thank you to our speakers for our time.
Thank you.
Thank you.